Question number 11, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What part did he have in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade's engagement of Alex Matheson, or his consultancy company, to work on Middle Eastern issues? And what other roles has Mr Matheson or his consultancy companies previously carried out for Hon Murray McCully or other entities he has been responsible for?
Speaker.
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr Speaker, Mr Matheson was appointed Special Envoy for Government Commercial Partnerships by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs after consultation with myself. He had previously served as Director of the Office of the Chief Executive at Industry New Zealand, as the New Zealand Trade Commissioner in Singapore, and as Head of Commercial Partnerships for the Rugby World Cup in the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Mr Matheson ceased to be a full-time employee of the Ministry quite some time ago. Has undertaken a range of other tasks for public and private entities, but those are not necessarily within the responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Did he know that while Mr Matheson was working on the Rugby World Cup, he was also being paid as an NZTE employee, meaning he was being paid twice by the government?
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr Speaker, any contractual or employment relationships Mr Matheson had with government departments or public entities at any time would have been subject to all of the normal rules associated with the public service, and I'd be very confident that they would have ensured those rules are followed.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, he was the Minister responsible for the Rugby World Cup. There is now none. The Minister, I asked him about whether he knew that fact. He does know, and he should be asked to answer that question, sir.
Well, the first part of your point of order I can't agree with. The Minister may well have been the Minister for the Rugby World Cup. He's not now. He's the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and in this question is to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He can only answer the question from that perspective. Supplementary question?
He didn't answer it.
Point of order.
I think the second part of David Parker's point of order is indeed very relevant, which was the question was, did he know? He then went on to talk about government department employment practices, but that wasn't the question. The question was, did he know?
No, I don't think that is the point, because, order, the question confused the role of the Minister as to whether he was our Minister for the Rugby World Cup, and then there was a reference to payment for NZTE. I let the question stand, accepting that I think there is some ministerial responsibility as Minister of Foreign Affairs for NZTE, but there is no ministerial responsibility at all for a portfolio held previously by that Minister.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David.
You'll be aware from the answer to the primary question that the Minister has worn a number of hats, and under those various hats he has used the services of Mr Matheson on a number of occasions. Mr Speaker, how can the House get to the bottom of this if the Minister, having acknowledged those different hats, is not willing to answer to the question that I asked in respect of these interconnections?
I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brown.
Mr Speaker, the Minister, I think, gave a very full answer in an attempt to be quite open with Parliament, etc., etc. What the member is now not accepting is the bounds of responsibility that any minister has to this Parliament at any given time. And I think the member over there knows that that is the case. It would be, sir, like we could use perhaps question time, as you've warned us not to in the past, to rake up all sorts of bad dealings by former Labor ministers, for example. But that's not permissible. Time moves on, responsibilities change.
No, I need no further assistance from any member on this matter. I sympathise with the position that Mr Parker finds himself in. I'm aware of the article that he used for authentication to have this question raised today. I spent some time with the clerk discussing how the member could perhaps get the answers that he wants, and under standing orders and speakers ruling and convention in this place, a minister can only be asked a question relating to portfolios that he currently holds. The way forward, I think, in answer to the point raised by the Honourable David Parker, is he must potentially try a series of questions addressed to different ministers who have responsibility. I know that uses some questions up for the opposition, but I can see no other way forward, except perhaps to consider whether he could frame a question to the Prime Minister, who clearly has a wider responsibility for all his ministers. Now, I've spent... It's a fresh point of order, then I'll be delighted to hear it.
It's relevant to what the Speaker's rule, but it is new. And that is that while ministers may not have ministerial responsibility for something, they may have awareness of other matters that relate to their ministerial responsibility. So in the case of conflicts of interest, for example, where somebody is appointed and there may be a conflict, the conflict may not arise directly out of the appointment they've been given, but another role they have for which the minister is not responsible or may have been previously responsible, and they can be questioned on that in their current portfolio if it relates to a decision made in their current portfolio.
I think the first point was relevant. When Minister may well be aware because of previous portfolios he held, previous history of this place, etc. I think the final point the member made in his point order is not right. Just because the member may be aware of a role that he held previously in another portfolio, he does not certainly have to answer that when he no longer holds that portfolio.
Mr. Speaker.
We've spent quite, unless it's a fresh point of order, but we're now
It is,
debating.
It is a fresh point of order.
Oh, fresh point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to put my next question to the Minister in his capacity as Minister for the Rugby World Cup.
There is no Minister for the Rugby World Cup.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Then how do I ever ask the Minister to answer a question that he has personal knowledge of in respect of this matter?
I'll help from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, there is the whole point here, and I want to bring up another matter with you when I've finished this. The point of question time is for ministers holding warrants in the government of the day to be questioned about that. This is not a star chamber where anybody can bring up any old allegation and throw it around any old way they like. And Mr. Parker, who prides himself on being a reasonably respectful juror and person who has a degree of standing in the law, should know that. The problem here, Mr. Speaker, my second point, is that this question, and frankly, should never have stood. And that you do need, sir, I think, to have further discussions with the Clerk's office about the potential for questions lodged like this to get into this sort of exact quagmire. It is not clear, when there are two parts here, why on earth the question could be asked about previously carried out for the Hon Murray McCully. So that's a specific question about an individual member. It is not a question about a minister or a minister's responsibilities now or in the past.
No, I don't. We're spending a lot of time on this. This is now unnecessary. Mr. Brownlee, I don't accept your final point. Is a lot of time went into this question. It was actually changed so that it was then accepted by the clerks as being relevant. It is an acceptable question asking the Minister of Foreign Affairs to respond to any involvement he might have had in the appointment of this particular person to a job, and then goes on to ask whether there's other entities. Clearly, those entities would only relate to anything within the portfolio as Minister of Foreign Affairs. The question was accepted, and as indeed I think the member himself raised in an earlier point of order, the question was then addressed by the Minister quite legitimately too. I sense the difficulty the member, the Honourable David Parker, is expressing and the frustration. I've suggested a couple of ways forward. He can take that advice. He can seek further advice from the clerk as to how to word questions. But on this particular occasion, unless he asks a question that's relevant, and in asking it to a former minister for a portfolio that is not even held at the moment, is not a satisfactory way forward.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
A fresh point of order?
Yes, it's a fresh point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I hope so.
Yeah.
For Sipkins.
Mr. Speaker, where portfolios are disestablished completely, the accountability for the decisions that were made within that portfolio when it was in existence still remains with the government. Right. Otherwise, the government could simply say, right, we're no longer going to have a Minister of Education or Housing, and therefore not answer any questions based on decisions they had previously made in those portfolios. The fact that the Minister for the Rugby World Cup position no longer exists does not mean that there is no longer government accountability for decisions that they made when there was such a portfolio. If we allow that to stand, then question time could become a farce because governments could just disestablish portfolios to avoid questions.
Canterbury earthquake.
The Honourable Cherry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, that's very interesting. If governments were enduring, then of course any minister on any day could answer questions about previous ministers of previous governments' activities. We, for example, would have a field day on questions about the minister who was responsible for Auckland matters, for example. Mind you, it would be very hard to find any work ever done in that portfolio. But, Mr Speaker, the point is that a government stands for the period of its election only, not in an enduring way, as Mr Hipkins is trying to suggest.
I think the matter's been discussed enough. I don't accept the final point made by Mr Hipkins. If a government any time was going to suddenly do away with the Minister of Education or the Minister of Health or any other portfolio simply because times were getting difficult, order! I think then the public of New Zealand would notice it and react accordingly. Have we got further? No. Well, the three other times I've asked you that, you've then continued to litigate. But I'll take your word for it, Mr.
Yes,
Hipkins.
absolutely a fresh point of order, Mr Speaker. On that ruling, is the Minister to whom does the government direct questions relating to the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority now that the portfolio position has been abolished?
I think the question could easily be reframed. There's still a minister responsible for the earthquake issues of Christchurch.
Just further to that point, sir,
I'll have one more point, but
the
that's
situation does not
wasting
apply in respect to the Rugby World Cup because there is no successor portfolio holder.
And exactly right. We've moved now to the 51st Parliament. The Rugby World Cup was quite some time ago, Mr Parker. We're now getting ready, in fact, for the next Rugby World Cup. Does the member have further supplementary question? The Honourable David Parker.
When the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade appointed Alex Matheson on Middle Eastern issues, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade aware that Mr Matheson had previously been paid by two government departments at the same time, one being NZTE and the other the Rugby World Cup?
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Speaker, as I stated in my response to the primary question, Mr Matheson was appointed Special Envoy for Government Commercial Partnerships. He was given that appointment by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs after consultation with myself. In terms of the second part of the question, I can confirm that, as I also said in my primary answer, that Mr Matheson was employed by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in relation to the Rugby World Cup, and at other times had served with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. In respect of neither of those two appointments, am I familiar with the detail of any contractual or employment relationships.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David.
My question was very specific. It asked at the time when the Ministry made the appointment, was the Minister aware, not the Ministry, was the Minister aware that previously Mr Matheson had been paid by two government...
I listened very carefully to the answer, and I think if the member had listened, the question was definitely addressed. The answer was given to the member. Fresh point of order?
Yes, sir. Well, I still don't know the answer to the question I asked. I don't know how you do.
Order. The member will be very lucky to stay if he has any more supplementaries. Listen to the answers. The Honourable David Parker, supplementary question.
When Alex Matheson was appointed as Middle Eastern representative of MFAT, did the Minister know that Mr Matheson previously had been paid twice by the government for services delivered at the same time for the Rugby World Cup and for NZTE?
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr Speaker, as I indicated in both my primary answer and the recent supplementary, Mr Matheson was never appointed to the role that he describes. He was appointed Special Envoy for Government Commercial Partnerships, an appointment made by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs after consultation with myself. I have also been clear that I was aware at that time that Mr Matheson had, as I described in my primary answer, been employed by New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, and on another occasion by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. I do not know whether those were employment or contractual relationships, whether they were at all stages full-time or part-time, or whether there was overlap between them. I simply did not have that command of detail.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Is the Minister telling the House that he did not know that Mr Matheson was double-dipping?
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr Speaker, I'm just going to respond very carefully to this because Mr Matheson is somebody who has served in a range of roles across a number of departments. I have thought highly of his work on behalf of the New Zealand Government, and I'm not at all surprised to see that senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Business and Innovation and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise have also thought sufficiently highly of Mr Matheson to appoint him to significant roles. And can I suggest to the member, if he wants to make defamatory statements about individuals, he best make those outside the House where he can face the full legal consequences of those statements.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David.
My question was a very simple one as to whether he knew, and he hasn't answered that question or attempted.
No, I've heard the question asked now 3 ways and 3 different answers have been given, or three answers have been given. Order not to the satisfaction of the member, I accept, but the question, in my opinion, was addressed.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Did the Minister, at the time of Mr Matheson's appointment in his MFAT role, know that Mr Matheson had been paid concurrently for 2 roles by the government, one by NZTE, one by the Rugby World Cup?
The Honourable Murray McCully.
Speaker, I have already been very clear about what I knew about the relationships that Mr Matheson had with a range of government departments. I have no idea about the payment relationships between him and those departments, whether they were full or part-time, employment or contractual, or whether there was any concurrency between those payments.
Question number 12, Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, thank you.
Tēnā koe.